That plane was shaking and rattling and rolling, and a few minutes before you knew it, we were airborne. Some of the men asked if they could smoke, but were told by the crewmen that it wasn't allowed. Whether they listened or not, Tom didn't say. They were in the air for some time before they saw the crewmen looking out, and paratroopers craned their necks to see what was happening around them. We're being greeted by the anti-aircraft fire from the Germans. I looked out the window. You could see the stuff, the flashes of the burst of the artillery shells. You could see the shells bursting outside the plane, and also you could see the machine gun fire in the distance. It looked like the bloody 4th of July. All of a sudden, we got the orders. Stand up and hook 'em. The silence was broken, and we finally jumped up and snapped our hooks onto the wire. This wire running along the top of the troop compartment deployed the trooper's parachutes when he cleared out of the aircraft. The paratroopers also had a reserve chute that they could pull in case the first failed to function. Once the men were hooked, they were ordered to sound off for an equipment check, meaning that their gear was in order and they were ready to jump. Being the last man on the ship, I had to give the reply first. I shouted, 17 okay. The next man shouted, 16 okay. And the countdown continued until it was 1 okay, which is the first man beside the sergeant, and a sergeant shouts, get in the door. My heart started pounding, and I was saying a prayer to myself. I was so scared that my knees were shaking, and just to relieve the tension, I knew that I had to say something. So I shouted, what time is it? Somebody answered me and told me it was about 2:30. Then all of a sudden we heard, are you ready? And all the troopers shouted all at once, yeah, let's go. Next to the aircraft's open door was a red light. When the pilot was over the drop zone, he would change the color and the men would exit. With flak bursting in the air, it must have felt like an age before the light changed to green and the paratroopers began to jump out into a night sky streaked with tracer fire and the flash of explosions. The men of Tom's stick began to disappear out of the door. He shuffled his way along beside them until he was the only paratrooper left in the aircraft. Without hesitation, he jumped into the sky. With the roar of the engine in my ears, I was out the door. Tom went through his drills and checks and realized that he'd made a good exit and everything was functioning with the parachute as it should. He now had a couple of seconds in the air before he would hit the dark ground below. I looked around and saw the brightness of the tracers flying into the sky, and the sound of machine guns firing seemed to be all around me. The ground quickly rushed up to meet him, and Tom bent his knees and prepared for impact. I had the shock of my life. I plunged into water. This passage was from a recent book called D-Day, The Unheard Tapes, which captured powerful eyewitness accounts of the Battle of Normandy in 1944. The book is written by my friend Geraint Jones, who we've got on the podcast today, and I'm very excited about. Geraint Jones is a British combat veteran and best-selling author whose work spans frontline nonfiction and historical fiction. He's written World War II oral histories, including The Voices of Victory and the D-Day Tapes, and a great Roman series with novels like Blood Forest and Legion, and I've got a copy of Siege here with me today. And just if I didn't show it before, this is D-Day, The Unheard Tapes. Highly recommend it. Before becoming a full-time writer, he served as an infantryman and later worked as a security contractor, experiences that inform his eye for logistics, leadership, and the human cost of war. He also hosts conversations with veterans and other creatives on his podcast, Veteran State of Mind, bringing soldierly realism to the page and the mic. Geraint, thanks for coming on, Subject Matter Expert. Glad to have you here.
How you doing, mate? It's great to be on. It's great to see you. It's always too long, whenever it is.
Well, it has been. I think it's appropriate to give a little bit of history here. You and I met out in, I believe it was San Diego, maybe, or LA, something like that.
I think it was LA. Yeah.
Was it LA? Yeah.
So it was Hollywood, mate, to be exact.
Okay. And yeah, and I remember I was out there in my van. I think I gave you a tour of my van that I was living in at the time. And what a cool way to meet. We hit it off right out of the way, both being men who like to rearrange words and formerly used to carry a gun around for a living. And you know, since then we've met up in, we've met up in San Antonio at the Black Rifle headquarters. We've met up out here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where I'm at right now. I think my studio actually is right across from the hotel that you stayed at while you were here. So yeah, I wish we could be in person now, but you're over there in the UK. I'm here, and I'm just excited to have you on to talk about some of your writing and some of your experiences.
Oh, thanks, mate. Yes, it's been a few years, mate. I've learned a lot from you along the way, particularly about the Oxford comma. So thanks. I do consider myself quite good at rearranging the words, but in terms of any kind of formal education and things like that, never had one. So, well, not when it came to what we do now. So, I like picking up some of these technical little tidbits that you leave out there on Instagram and stuff. It's very informative.
I'm learning as I go. I also, it's not like I have an English lit degree or anything like that. We've both had to just kind of bootstrap our way into this author business. I want to get right into it. That passage that I read from, it's one of my favorite out of the book. There's lots of powerful passages, and just knowing that the quotes that you have are just very directly from these interviews that were done. And I think you told me that there were hundreds of hours or maybe thousands of hours of interviews that you sorted through.
Yeah, I mean, both with Voices of Victory and the Unheard Tapes, we use predominantly the interviews from the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, which is just an incredible resource, and in a way has kind of informed a lot of what I'm doing now with the podcast, but we can kind of come on to that. But, a lot of these interviews could be, some of them are 2 hours long. That's kind of the shortest they tend to be. A lot of them can run to 8 hours plus. And you can obviously pull out a little bit when from these to make it, if you're only covering the Battle of Normandy, because even though the book's called D-Day, I wanted to get the entire Battle of Normandy in there. You can kind of cherry pick a bit, but it's, there's a lot of things that can be in an interview, as that there might be earlier experiences that they've had in combat in other theatres that you kind of want to pull into the book because it might inform the story. You might want some of their background, what happened to them after the war. So for each one, it might have ended up just being a paragraph or two of quote in the book, but you've probably had to go through 4 hours of interview for that. So when you're dealing with 150 quote unquote characters in the book, it's a lot of audio to go through, a lot of transcription, and people also will, can't you just get AI to do the transcription? To which I would say, try to get AI to do a transcript of a 90-year-old from Newcastle, with a thick accent and everything like that. I did try it at once, and I found that the best thing, and to be honest, the most enjoyable thing, is to just stick your headphones on, listen, transcribe it yourself, just pick out the parts as you kind of go. But yeah, I mean, what a thing to do for a job, to get to listen to those interviews all day
and go through and listen to them yourself. You're the person that has to pull all this together into a coherent story and a story that does justice to these men and the actions that they are relaying, all these years later. It's a heavy responsibility. I know you're a former soldier yourself, and so I imagine there was a variety of reasons for being motivated to do a book like this, but what was the original spark for this?
Well, my editor, I did 2 books about Afghanistan. One was called No Way Out, which was written by Major Adam Jowett, which I was co-writer on that with him. And then I did Brothers in Arms. Both of these were with an editor named Ingrid. She's at Pan Macmillan. And she just gets it, when it comes to soldiers. She doesn't want to glorify anything. She doesn't want a surface level, kind of, and then we shot someone here and then we shot someone there. She wants to get into those human stories. And she approached me and said there was an opportunity to do this D-Day book as an accompaniment to a TV series that was being made for the History Channel and the BBC. Just to kind of go into that a little bit, that series was, I just thought it was a fantastic idea from the beginning, because what they were doing is they would take these audio recordings that were given by the people who were there themselves, but then using a bit of manipulation, they then lip synced with actors who were in uniform and doing these kind of short scenes of the beaches. Because one of the biggest problems, and I have this myself, it's so hard to see, because, when you and I were growing up, we were very lucky enough to be around World War II veterans. But we've only ever known them as men with grey hair, yes, and older guys and granddad and stuff like that. And, there's a certain attachment that comes to people like that. They're people we were in awe with just because of who they were in our families and our neighborhoods and that kind of thing to begin with. So the idea of trying to see these people as 18-year-old kids on a beach, or probably leaving their country for the first time, and that's what the series wanted to go out and do. So I knew I wanted to be involved straight away. So I kind of bit their hand off on that. Didn't have much time to get the book done, which is why it's Voices of Victory has a lot more kind of context put around the voices as well. But obviously, the way I see it with war stories is if somebody was there, I want to hear the story from them. Like it's as simple as that. And we're so lucky with these resources, in whether it be interviews, sometimes done by museums, sometimes just done by somebody with an interest who goes around his local town and interviews people. And I think if someone's put their own experiences down, then that's where I want to be hearing it from. There's a lot of great books, and we need those books about, this division moved here and this division moved here, and this is how many tons of logistics they had. Great. Okay, that's all kind of important. But the reason war's so terrible is because it affects people. And so I want to hear the stories from the people. And I think that's why the two books have done well as well, because everybody can, one, picture people that they knew there, and two, you can start to picture yourself in those situations as well.
I mean, at their root, these really are human stories, but with human stories comes, things that we humans like to do. That, you catch a fish one day and all of a sudden it's 2 inches longer tomorrow when you tell the story, and it's a foot longer when you tell the story a year from now, right? And I kind of wonder, I don't think that World War II veterans, despite them being the greatest generation, were immune from some of these things that more modern soldiers have done as well. As you were going through these tapes, did you have a technique for kind of sorting through what may have been a little bit of embellishment or misremembering or even myth? That, there's lots of battleground myths where the person telling it isn't lying. This is what they heard through the trenches sort of thing. And I mean, how did you sort through all of that?
Well, the first thing is to put a caveat in the introduction that kind of thing can happen, right? And I was very lucky with D-Day that there was actually a quote from a captain in the Rangers that landed at Pointe du Hoc, who in his interview gave this fantastic quote about the problems with memory. So I was like, great, I don't even have to do this myself. Put his quote in. But then there's other parts as well. Like, as soldiers, we all have the sniff test, don't we? And there's some stories that just don't pass the sniff test. But you never want to just dismiss something out of hand. So then a lot of it comes down to kind of just... I don't know what it's like for the American military, but the British Army loves a good old record book, right? So you've got unit histories that cover the day-to-day actions of that regiment in the field. And it doesn't... a lot of the time, it depends on who. I imagine it was probably like the adjutant of the unit or something who was recording these. Some of them, the level of depth in there is incredible. And others, it's very kind of short. Sometimes they're written in pencil. It can be very hard to see. Other times they're typed out. But you can quite often kind of, cross, you might, because, for instance, I came across one of Voices of Victory, and one of the soldiers was saying that they'd come under attack by King Tiger tanks. Now, there's something with soldiers that a lot of time in the Second World War, the whole thing was whenever they saw a tank, it was always a Tiger tank, in their mind, where most of the time it wouldn't be. So it's okay. Well, was he really seeing King Tiger tanks? Let's go to the war diary. Oh yeah, counterattack on I think it was A Company with two Tiger tanks. All right, cool, confirmed. So there's ways of doing that, but I think a lot of it just comes down to the sniff test as well. And the other thing I'd say with oral histories is it's about that kind of person's experiences and how that's informed the rest of their life. And if someone For instance, one of the, again, to tanks is, and there's an academic argument that the Sherman tank was a better tank than the German tanks, because it could be produced in bigger numbers, etc., etc., etc. But if you're an 18-year-old, sitting in that tank, and you really believe your tank is going to get turned into a bonfire by a German tank, does it really matter if there's an academic argument about that? Well, no, it's how you feel. And that is always, at the end of the day, I will always lean towards what the soldier's saying rather than what an academic 80 years later is saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the opinion of people that develop these weapons, equipment, things like that. and then there's the people that actually, the end user that has to use them, and usually there's a little bit of a disparity there between the two.
Right.
And it's funny that you talk about the Tiger tank and how everything was a Tiger tank. It's kind of like in Afghanistan, there was always the rumor of Chechens. There's Chechens on every target, and
Exactly.
and, how many Chechens were actually out there? Probably not that many, but. It's funny.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about going through books like this is you find out, gosh, the more things change, the more they don't. And a soldier is a soldier. And I want to keep talking about World War II for a bit here, but I think we can go all the way back to the Romans and find that the legionnaires were not too different than this young man hooking up his static line as he flew towards the Norman coastline, and that paratrooper is not so different than what you and I did. It's just as far as mentality and the things that we thought about, that we missed home, that we may have missed our girlfriend or our wife back home, that we were maybe scared of the action coming up, maybe anticipating it at the same time. These are all things that seem to just transcend generations and armies and nations, that these are just soldier experiences. And I think that's that's the most interesting part for me, is seeing how much we have in common still with people that served in what we consider extremely extraordinary circumstances. I mean, you brought up that there's the sniff test that we all have as soldiers about whether that seems like a little bit too tall of a tale or not. I mean, if I didn't have history books to back it up, if you told me about the events of D-Day, I'd say, man, I don't know. Are you sure the entire horizon was blotted out by ships? There was that many ships. Are you exaggerating a little bit there? That the sky was blotted out by how many aircraft? Are you sure that there was that many? Well, we've got the records to back that up. And I think that's the hard thing specifically with D-Day, is it is so incredible in the truest sense of the word, and throughout the history of warfare. It would be hard for me to figure out what was a tall tale or not, because the whole thing just seems so massive and incredible, and the violence so extreme.
Yeah, and the thing with, there's a little inside baseball for people here when it comes to publishing. There are, and this is a horrible way to say it, but it's just the way to say it. There are brands in military history that publishers are excited about publishing and that sell well. And one of those quote unquote brands, because I can't think of a better word to describe this, is D-Day. And that's what the TV documentary was about. But I really wanted to not just tell the story of D-Day, but tell the story of the Battle of Normandy. Because, once those guys were on shore, they were fighting Normandy for 3 months. And it was not like, the beaches were meat grinder, but so were the hedgerows that they had to keep pushing through. Like these men would talk about, if they made a couple of 100 yards advance in a day, that was a really good day. To get through these densely packed hedgerows and sunken roads. And for instance, there was a hill 112. So that means it's a pretty small hill, but in Normandy, which is quite flat, a hill of 100 meters height is a very strategically valuable point. Now there's a division, the 43rd Wessex Division, who didn't land on D-Day. They came in the days that followed, and their first major action was at Hill 112. Now, a infantry division in the British Army at the time was 15,000 people. Well, within 48 hours, the Wessex Division had taken, in that division, about 50% casualties. And who were they up against? They weren't up against these kind of Ost battalions, where you had guys who didn't really want to be there, but it was a choice of prisoner of war or serve. They were up against SS Panzer divisions, equipped with all of their tanks and all of their young, willing soldiers. And, this is what these guys were up against. And this was the Wessex Division's first trial by fire in the war. And they're going up against these experienced, Panzer divisions. And I just thought, we know a lot about D-Day and we can always learn more, and we always should try and learn more. But it's these other battles that continue to rage afterwards that I think we all overlook, and I include myself in
that. I mean, we've both been driven around the area that is present day Normandy and seen a lot of these towns, and it's still, most of the countryside still bears the scars of those battles, specifically Pointe du Hoc or Pointe du Hoc, and many of the towns still have bullet holes you can see in walls and things like that. It's really intense to see, and it's hard to understand what it would be like to fight through that until you've actually been there, and that none of the roads are particularly straight. There's not a great way to navigate if you aren't from there. And it just, I could see people getting turned around real easy as they're trying to move in these massive vehicle columns that the Germans have had a long time to familiarize themselves with. And you bring up a great point I'd never really thought about before. For the Americans and the British landing here, this is all their first taste of combat. Most of them, some of them I think had come over from the Pacific, but for most of them, this is their first taste of combat. For the Germans they're fighting, they had to push from wherever they were in Germany all the way to Normandy, and had seen more than their fair share of gunfights as they rolled through Western Europe. So yeah, that notion of new soldier fighting against experienced soldier, I'd never even considered that before. But as you were going through and doing the research here, just again as a soldier yourself, was there any small sort of sensory detail that you picked up on through some of these interviews? Maybe it was from inside a landing craft, or a fight outside of a hedgerow or a church square, that kind of said more than any big battle sequence that you covered.
Probably the smell of death. So in Normandy, there was a lot of cattle, and the German army used a lot of horses. And then obviously there's the human dead as well. And everybody talked about how bad it smelled. Like Normandy just stank of death. It was everywhere. And that is something that, I've been shot at, things like that, but I've never gone from, and I've smelled dead things, right? But I've never gone from mile where the smell of death is just in your nose all the time. That was one. Another one as well. It's something again you don't even think about, is the fact that these guys were plagued by mosquitoes. Because summer in Normandy, and the mosquitoes would bother some of the guys. They would be driven mad more by mosquitoes than by getting shelled every day, and little things like that, which seems increased, isn't it? It's like, but if you've ever been in somewhere with like really dense mosquitoes and not being able to get away from them, I can almost see that. Like, yeah, I can see how that could get to you more than shelling after a while. It's just seems to be no escape.
Or more just the cumulative effect of you're dealing with shelling, and you can't even get a break in between the shelling because the mosquitoes are coming at you.
Right. Yeah, and the kind of places where a lot of these front lines quite often end up along rivers, don't they? Along rivers, and in densely kind of dense undergrowth and things, because nobody's going to dig in and straight across the middle of a big open field. Not that there's really many of those in Normandy at the time, but it's just these little things about what bothered people, But yeah, I think in terms of like the senses, the sense of smell is something that I probably had not. It's something that I'd considered for, say, the First World War in the trenches. We all kind of have that. Oh yeah, because we all knew there's bodies everywhere. But for Normandy or something, it's just something that you can't. And it's like you can't really picture. You go there now, it's such an idyllic place. The idea of that place just smelling like rotting flesh everywhere. It's hard to get your head around.
That's something that always struck me, is that, I've had the privilege of being able to travel over there with World War II and Normandy veterans. And it's just imagining because I'm stumbling over my words here because it's such a hard thing to describe, but I can imagine what that must be going through their mind, having come to Normandy for the first time in many cases 75, 80 years, and seeing it now, like you said, idyllic and beautiful, and a place you would want to go on vacation and all sorts of stuff. And then their last reference point was possibly the worst place on earth at that time. And just to have what that must have been like for those guys to process that, where this place existed in their head as the worst place on earth. And now you're here, you know, having tea in a French chateau and very comfortable, and, you know, and you know, people are giving you the hero's welcome, and rightfully so. It must be a strange thing for those soldiers to have experienced coming back.
Yeah, and on the hero's welcome, it wasn't always the case that they were at the time in the war given the hero's welcome, because Normandy had escaped. You know, it wasn't an area that really got bombed or anything. It's not like there's a big industrial center there, so it wasn't really kind of getting bombed. It hadn't really been fought over, during the Battle of France so much. So it really escaped a lot of the war. And by this point, you know, there's been Germans living there for a while. People have just kind of fell into this new way of life. Now, obviously, there's some people who are in the resistance who are actively opposing this. But as with most places in the world, there's a lot of people who just want to go along to get along, right? Or get along to go along. And then all of a sudden, you know, your herd of cows, which has been generations in the farm, you know, and your source of income has just been blown apart by naval gunfire. You know, one of your buildings is now full of troops, or it had someone firing from there, so it's been absolutely leveled, you know, and now you're a refugee. And so a lot of people were quite pissed off because, you know, they just wanted to get on with their lives, and now everything's gone. And so we do see these pictures of, obviously, certain villages, usually the ones that were kind of got lucky and didn't get fought over. You know, you might get those scenes, but a lot of the times, you know, people are actively angry. I mean, I remember one story from an American soldier in the Cherbourg Peninsula, and she was carrying her dead kid around. He'd been killed by American mortar fire, and she was livid with the American soldiers, as someone who lost a child, you know, would be. So I think we always have to keep in mind when we see these pictures of either the extreme brutality or these extreme moments of, thanks so much, you know, you guys are the best, kind of. The truth is always in the middle. With, if you'd have interviewed 100 people from France at the time, I mean, dude, like, look at the city of Caen. Yeah. You know, you've probably been to Caen. That place was flattened by bombing. You know, I do forget, it's been 2 years since I worked on the book now, but I know the number of French civilians killed by Allied bombing around this period was over 10,000. You know, so if you'd lost half of your family, are you really feeling that happy to be liberated? You know, you might have just preferred to just keep going as things were. You know, there's no simple answer. For every human being who lived in that period, there's a different answer, you know. Different shades to
think
it.
About that, and this is a little bit of a trope at this point to put it in these terms, but 10,000 French people killed during the invasion there. That's 4 9/11s for a small area, you know, for a small population. Yeah. It's that's not nothing. Yeah,
exactly right. So, and like I said, these you'd got people who had been in part of the resistance who immediately, you know, well, not just immediately, they were very instrumental in helping to shape the battlefield, you know, taking out train lines that could bring out reinforcements, but taking down comms lines, all that kind of thing. And then, you've got other people who, to put it quite frankly, quite happy with the Germans being there. And I think that was one of the things I tried to do with the book as well, because I think especially through film and things, we have been given a very black and white picture of what it was like. And I was kind of surprised by the amount of stories that I came out of. Because I'd always thought, of course, Germans shoot prisoners. The Germans are bad guys, aren't they? But the amount of stories of British, Canadian, American soldiers killing prisoners, like, not every now and again, just pretty much as par for the course. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, a lot of reasons for it, but I was kind of quite shocked by how often it was. And then once you listen to these guys and they kind of give their explanations why it happens, it kind of makes a lot of sense. I mean, and the idea that there is, you know, a whiter than white side in war is quite ridiculous.
This is why these guys talked about how it's hard to, you know, they didn't want to talk about it. You bring that up in the book of it. This is, as kids, we were told, Grandpa doesn't like to talk about this. And, and part of it is because it's hard to explain those things. Some of these guys, it wasn't just because they saw their friends die. It was because they maybe participated in horrible things, or they don't want to necessarily feel lesser than if you're expecting a war story, but all they can complain about was the mosquitoes and things. War is a complicated place, and you're experiencing the extremes of all these different human experiences. And that's a hard thing to explain to people that have never experienced even an extreme of the human experience, never mind multiple. I mean, I think that we look back at World War II specifically with rose-colored glasses and think it's the good war, right? It was the very justified war. It was good versus evil. It was, the American, the British, the West versus the Nazis. It was, painted in these terms that in almost a way that looks down with derision on soldiers that came later. And, when we talk about, we're going through it right now with the war on terror, right? There's things that happened on the battlefield or in combat that are being relitigated as war crimes and things like that. Some of them rightfully so. Some of them, I don't know. We'll see what the process reveals, but the judicial process reveals. But to act like this is some phenomena that soldiers have not always been doing this. This was going on in World War II as well. It's just that those stories weren't being told, and there weren't, helmet cams and things like that to show it. And I think that's an important thing to point out. Of war is terrible. Like, it is a terrible, terrible thing, even when it is a quote unquote good war.
No, absolutely, mate. And I think as well, if you'd have served in that war and you see all the films that kind of came out at the time, and even like up to even Saving Private Ryan, the good guys are still really clean-cut good guys, aren't they? For all of its realism in action, it's still a very rose-painted kind of picture of soldiers. For Granddad to say to the kids, I used to give a cigarette to a woman so that I could, have my way with her. I think I definitely was one of these people who was very naive about what I was like, and I appreciate the honesty of those people actually telling it as it is in their interviews, because they could have taken it to their grave with them. And I wonder if it's as they got older in their lives and they probably kept witnessing more wars and more wars, they thought, well, maybe we should have been a bit more honest about this. Yeah, because a lot of the guys, when I got to the end of the interviews, there's no one more anti-war than a veteran, right? And I think a lot of these people were kind of coming, because a lot of these interviews are done, these people were at the end of their lives. They were, a lot of them mid-80s, some of them even 90s. And I think they're like, well, if I'm going to leave here, there's one message I'm going to leave behind. It's, I don't want to go through this again. And a lot of them will, and it's tragic really to think that their last kind of years in life were worried that it was all going to happen again. I think if you'd been through something like that and then you'd had a few decades of relative peace, especially for Europe, when you consider how bloody Europe has been always, to have some peace in Europe for like 30, 40, 50 years, you might be thinking, you know what, maybe it was worth it. And then, over say the last 20 years, and I think a lot of them started to question things. I know it seems to be something that's kind of come out in, like, especially the later interviews that I listened to.
Yeah, I imagine that's got to be hard to see. I mean, right now you've got the two largest armies in Europe at war with each other in an actual shooting war, and that's got to be a strange thing for the very few World War II veterans left behind, and those that have been around for the last couple of years to see happening. I can only imagine what's going through their head. As you were doing the research for this and going through these tapes, what did you learn about fear management and unit cohesion, right? Like, from the way ordinary soldiers describe the hours before and after first contact, like fear management, but keeping the unit together and moving forward.
Well, I think humor is always a big part of it, right? I think your unit, say like a platoon level, or even company, I think a lot of that morale of that company can hinge on two or three people. If if you have a couple of larger than life characters or a couple of guys who are always, they don't need to be positive people. They could be extremely negative, but in that negativity is that positivity of like, it's like that if you ever read George MacDonald Fraser's book about his time in Burma, the Second World War, there's that guy before every action, it's like, we'll all get killed, but it's just that funny resignation of, all right, we'll all be dead. And it's like, okay, well, fuck it. I guess we're all going to get, sorry, didn't mean to swear. We're all going to get killed together. And it's that almost sense of like shared fatalism. It could be that, or it could be, you know, your prototypical heroic, inspiring leader who, you know, your Dick Winters kind of guy who takes things, who takes action from the front, who'd never ask anyone to do anything that they wouldn't do themselves. And again, you know, not necessarily the most liked guy in his unit at the beginning of the training or anything, but just somebody who people come to respect because it's like this guy is always at the front of everything. He's never used, like, I think soldiers feeling used is something that they never respond positively to. If you know that somebody is trying to use you because he's on a career path and he wants to get a few extra juicy, you know, like juicy actions under his belt, and like the higher casualty rate might look good on his report, you know, he led his company through and they suffered 80% casualties. That might look good on his CV as he's, you know, going up to be a general or whatever, but it's not very good for the 80% of his company who didn't come through. So I think guys are always willing to accept danger as so long as they think that there's a reason behind it. And for the guys in Normandy and for the guys in Voices of Victory, which was Germany at the end of the war, that reason was, sooner we get this done, sooner we can come home. So we have to remember this is largely a citizen army at this point. You know, these guys did not grow up wanting to be soldiers. And a lot of the people who joined voluntarily at the beginning of the war, by this point, have been killed, you know, or wounded, or this was another thing that surprised me. They might have been wounded a couple of times, sent back, got patched up, and come back to the front. So there's very few people by this stage of the war who have any kind of romanticism about it or anything like that. It's as one of the guys said, it's a job of work. And I think the other thing to remember about a lot of these guys, they worked dangerous jobs when they were back home. Like they were miners, or they were working in shipyards where people
building
could get killed
skyscrapers
on a daily
in New
basis.
York.
Right, exactly. So it was an extreme, but they saw it as, well, this is a job. It's a dangerous job. The sooner we get the job done, the better our chances. So, you know, it's not going to finish by us sitting around and refusing to advance. So let's just get up and get it done, and you know, and get ourselves home. But yeah, just to wrap up on that, I do think that humor and that black humor as well is, I think, an absolute essential for anybody on a front line.
And you see it today, not just with soldiers, but frontline medical workers. The darkest humor that you can find anywhere is inside an emergency room staff, right? It's it is the thing that we use to cope, and it's often not pretty, but it's effective. It's very effective.
I mean, I'm reading a book right now about a memoir from a doctor in Vietnam. And sometimes the humor is so callous that, as someone who's like an infantryman kind of sympathizing with a guy on the operating table, I can take offense. But then obviously you realize, like, well, this doctor's doing what he needs to do to get through that. And if that means making jokes about the guy who's missing his legs on the table, then so be it. Because if he doesn't do that, he can't operate on the next guy who comes in, because he's going to break. And I definitely think that we have humor for a reason, and it gets us through these times. And I always try and caution people against judging the standards of humor on any kind of front line, any kind of dangerous work, judging that by the standards of quote unquote polite society.
It's not a polite place. As you were going through and doing the research for this, obviously you had the tapes of these interviews, but what other primary sources did you use that were maybe very effective for you to tell the story?
So on D-Day, it was D-Day. I was, to be honest, due to time constraints, mostly kind of focused from the interviews, because we were trying to cover German voices, French voices, American voices, Canadian voices. So there's not much room for context. I think it's a 120,000 word book as it is. So, and then the choice came down to, in order to get more context in, you then have to start removing people. So with Voices of Victory, I decided to just focus on the British voices so that I could give more context. That didn't work out well because I just put more people in, and then the first draft was 200,000 words long. I managed to get the book through at 150,000 words in the end, but I said to the editor, I was like, I can't cut these people out now because I'm too attached to them. You are going to have to commit this and hack these out. But so with Voices of Victory, it was a lot of archive stuff like the regimental war diaries, regimental histories, memoirs. So a lot of units at the end of the war published these on basically like a little booklet. I think we had one after Iraq, actually, like where you essentially, they'd have the list of all the actions that they'd been in and medal winners. And then that's another great resource as well, is, I could get on the National Archives, and there's all these digitized records of medal citations and things like that. So if you have, let's say, for a particular action, and by action, what I'm talking about is within, say, the Battle of Normandy, an action could be an attack on a chateau on one day by one battalion. That would be an action. And if you've got a few oral histories, and you've got maybe as a memoir that touches on it, then maybe there's a couple of different regimental records, and then maybe there's some medal citations. By the time you get all that together, there's quite a lot of information in there that you can pull out. And one of the kind of the fun things was this, and because it can be quite a fun job. I mean, it is a fun job. I wouldn't do it. There'd be times where I'd be reading an action from another unit, and you'd go, "Hang on, this sounds really familiar to this other story that I've been hearing from this other regiment." And you start to piece things together, and before you know it, you could piece together a battle scene from a few different angles by 3 different units. So you've got the tank crewman story, and then you've got the infantryman, and then you've got this artillery captain who was, behind the lines providing the artillery support. And so then trying to piece those battles together, going from different points of view, almost like you would do in a movie. That's how I try to write it, is that you're almost seeing it like a film where you're going from these one scene to the other, and the one scene obviously informs the next. And I think the National Archive, I think, is in the UK. It's totally. It's a treasure, to be honest, an absolute treasure chest. Some of the stuff is online. The other stuff, you got to go old school, get on a photocopier. To be able to have access to that, and it's amazing as well to read when you're reading something that's been. Sometimes it's so blasé that they might have been in these, because from the stories how bad that action was, and it might just have one little line that
pulls everything together. What was the British Army or the MOD helpful at all, or did you pursue their help, I guess?
I didn't. No. I kind of had a few people help me where I found there's people who are kind of, they know their way around the archive, and you can hire them, and they'll go and do the photocopying and stuff like that for you. So you find out what you want, you give them the archive number, they go and get it done. You get a PDF with all this information on it. It's always a bit like Christmas waiting for that stuff to come, because sometimes you'll open a file and you'll just find that it's one of the ones with, it's very clearly written, it's got all this information in, and you're just like, jackpot. And other times it might come and it's missing half the pages, and that one day that you needed is one of the pictures, the files that's missing. And obviously with a lot of this stuff as well, that there is a lot of it that it has just been lost to history. There's no guarantee that you can go and find the answer that you're looking for sometimes, and it's really quite disappointing. What I found as well is with the book about Germany in 1945, there is so little of that material compared to what there is for the Battle of Normandy, and I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is I think a lot of people, soldiers and civilians, had been sold on the idea of, look, Normandy's going to be bloody, but we'll get in there, we knock the Germans out, it's the end of the war. And then they had to do Belgium and Holland. And then they had to do Germany. And by this point, there's very few blokes. So to give you an idea of the attrition in an infantry battalion, there was one soldier, and this was quite common across, but I used his quote in the book. When they got to the end of the war, they're a battalion of 800 people. And the CO addresses the battalion, says, hope some of you are going to stay on with the army. You know, I know the rest will be demobbed. Hope I run into you again. Can everyone who's been with the battalion since Normandy please remain on parade? And almost that entire battalion marched off the square, and there was a handful of guys left. And the CO saw how few guys were there. He burst into tears and ran off the parade square. You know, there was maybe like a few dozen guys out of the entire battalion who'd gone through from Normandy to the end of Germany. And within those would have been the chefs and things like that as well. And some of those guys who were still standing there, they would have been wounded and come back as well. Like, the chances of you going from Normandy to the end of the war without being wounded were, in an infantry battalion, practically nil.
That sounds like something straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, I can literally picture you know, a big battalion formation and having everybody fall out and just a few people left, and what those guys, I mean, even if they were a support guy or something, what they would have seen, what they would have endured, you know, that's an incredible visual. Yeah.
And so I think that, so when Britain was fighting its break-in battle into Germany, in this area around this, kind of on the border of Holland and Germany, there's an area called the Reichswald Forest. And you know, I got the casualty reports for those battalions after 12 days of fighting through this forest. And they're down, you know, they're all down 50% in a week of fighting. And what was happening at this point is Britain was really scraping the barrel for guys, because, you know, we're not a big country. And they were pulling, so that you're getting 17-year-olds getting called up, getting 3 months of training, getting to the front line, and quite often getting killed or wounded in the first couple of days in action. And I think a lot of people, because obviously the First World War was within, you know, that was 20-something years ago. Like, if you were a soldier on the front line then, your dad had probably been through the trenches. So within the country, everybody knew how possible a stalemate was and what that meant. And so I think the reporting on these things at the time, like, there wasn't much of an appetite for the reporting. Like, the battle in the Reichswald Forest wasn't reported on when it was happening. It was weeks later that it came out, because I don't think they wanted people to, you know, everyone had been told the war's nearly over. And it's like, well, if the war's nearly over, why is this battalion going through a meat grinder in this forest, and all these 18-year-old kids are dying? When you look at the casualty reports, you know, for Normandy, there's a lot of guys in their 20s kind of thing on those graves. And then when you get to the end of the war, the amount of 18-year-olds, even 17-year-olds, and this is something that the soldiers talked about as well. You know, they talked about how sad it was to see these kids come out, because these guys, you know what it's like if you're in the military. If you're in your mid-20s, an 18-year-old's a kid. And these lads who are in their mid-20s, who have, you know, they're the old sweats. They're seeing these 18-year-olds come in, and they're trying to give them what experience they can. But you haven't got, you know, it's not a forgiving learning environment. You know, you make one mistake and you're dead. And so I think there wasn't the appetite to record it at the time. And then, unlike every other battle, when the battle in Germany finished, it was the end of the war. Well, now who wants to spend time sitting down and recording stories about the war? Who cares? It's finished. Let's get on with the peace. So I feel like that last part of the war really got underreported on, because the focus has always been on the peace at the end of that campaign, you know, which you didn't get in any of the other campaigns. And because of that, there's a knock-on effect where people will come to write a book and go, well, there's not many resources on this, so I'll just do a D-Day book. And also because, like I was telling you earlier, how publishers have these kind of quote-unquote brands that they like, it's a lot easier to get a book deal for a D-Day book. So you end up over time with these it just veers off the amount of resources that's available on one campaign compared to another, and becomes like a self-perpetuating kind of cycle.
So as you were going through all that, though, what's the biggest misconception that you dispelled about D-Day? What are the big misconceptions about D-Day out there?
I think one of the misconceptions, I think the biggest one would be, and I don't know if this is maybe so much as a misconception of just, but the fact that I think this idea that, say, D-Day was I guess I'm trying to figure a way of putting it. I think everyone sees D-Day as this worst day of combat in Western Europe. And I don't think you can really grade things against each other and say, well, this day was worse than this day. But I think that maybe the misconception is that people think that D-Day was the worst day and that things got better from there. And from what I could see, D-Day was hell, and then hell just continued for another 3 months. And then it stopped periodically, and then would continue. But I think it's that. I think it's that we know, for instance, the guys that landed on Utah Beach, the general consensus is, Utah Beach wasn't so bad. And like the squad leader says in the book, he's like, I lost one of my squad on Utah Beach. The next day, going into, starting to clear through these flooded fields and that stuff, I lost half my squad. He said, so our D-Day wasn't D-Day, it was the next day. And I think there's a lot of stories like that. So I think it's this kind of misconception that there was a slaughterhouse on the beaches, and then it was, right, we've got them on the run. I think
I've heard that from people I've talked to just in casual conversation, where, Omaha Beach is put kind of on a pedestal, and, certainly it was extremely brutal. But, other beach landing sites like Sword Beach, which was primarily the British and Australian, because they weren't American. In America, they don't get quite the same attention, I don't think. And thus are looked at maybe as, well, that's not where the action was. It was on Omaha because that's where the Americans were. Like, can you speak to that at all? As far as, I think that's another one of the misconceptions out there.
Yeah, I think so. I was told this by because I'm by no means a D-Day expert. I think if I'm an expert on anything, it's probably soldiers, right? But I spoke to an expert on, he's an expert specifically on Sword Beach, and he said, people need to remember that there was one division landed on the British beach at Sword, one division landed at Gold Beach, one division landed at Juno Beach, one division landed at Utah, two divisions landed at Omaha. So while casualty numbers might be higher, that's from two divisions, as opposed to one on the others. And he said that when you kind of when you start accounting for things like that, there's not really much discrepancy between, say, an Omaha and a Sword or a Juno. I think it's just fair to say it was fucking horrible. Sorry, it was horrible for everyone. And it was, you could, and even on the beaches, there could be, you could have a different experience landing a couple hundred meters apart. It's just one of those. I like to just think of the landings as one rather than start to, because you can start breaking it down by, okay, but you were on the beach at this, you were on the first wave at this beach. So what would be worse, being on the first wave at Sword Beach or the fifth wave at Omaha? So I just think it's comparing apples and oranges. I certainly agree that other beaches totally get overlooked. And, this is true for the Brits as well. I mean, maybe not American listeners, but everyone in Britain's probably heard of Pegasus Bridge. The gliders come down early hours in the morning and seize this really vital bridge on the edge of the battlefield. And it's a very important bridge to hold because it will stop the Germans being able to use it for the panzers to kind of come up and counterattack the beaches and potentially roll the flanks of the beaches. So everyone knows, a lot of people in Britain will know that bridge was seized by men of the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire light infantry. Oxford Bucks. And that is, that was a vicious battle. They had to hold on for days. And again, like a lot of these other battalions continue to fight on in that area for weeks. But not many people know about the fact that they also participated in the Rhine crossing in 1945 and took 50% casualties in a day on that. And, you go to Pegasus Bridge and there's museums, everything in that. There's placards all over the town. It's fantastic, to be honest, the way they honor those men. But then you go to Hamiltown, where they did the Rhine crossing, and there's a stone about this big with a plaque on it, and that's it. And they lost 50% of their battalion in one day, including men who had been at Pegasus Bridge. And so I think when it comes to war and the Second World War, I think it's a case that is far more overlooked than what gets, there's a few campaigns that maybe are given the just attention, D-Day being one of them. And I feel like almost everything else is overlooked. And I mean, it's understandable, like not everyone can spend the time becoming a military historian. But I do think that those of us who are in that space need to do a better job of trying to, it's easy to do a D-Day post and put it on Instagram and know that it's going to get a certain amount of traction. But, but I feel there's almost a kind of duty to, try and share these other stories of other campaigns. You might only reach one person with that story, but that's great. Just keep doing that. Keep reaching one person and building up these knowledge of these other equally important, equally bloody battles. Because, the truth with everyone likes to say, especially, publishers on book covers, the turning point of the war, the turning point of the war. Every bloody battle's a turning point.
At any point along the way, the war could have been lost.
Right. Exactly. There's so many moments where one thing could start swinging things in another direction. I kind of feel that it's you kind of you've kind of got to take a horse to water with it. Us being the guys taking, and people who are not maybe as lucky as us to get to spend this amount of time on these projects. So
did any of the veterans that were featured in the book, were they around to read the book or get a chance to read the book? I'm curious if you got any feedback like that.
So for the D-Day book, it was one of the saddest parts about doing the book, because you spend these hours listening to these people talk, and by the end of it, you feel like you kind of know that person, and you certainly have the utmost respect for them. And sometimes, they showed extreme vulnerability and things as well, and you might have had a cry listening to them, and then you put the name in to Google, and it's obituary. And so through the D-Day book, I didn't ever get that experience, but I have since met D-Day veterans who were not included in the book, and to be able to give them a copy of it was pretty special. I went and interviewed a man recently. He was in the turrets of one of the battleships doing the bombardments, and he still got, the message that they got from Eisenhower, the message of the day.
Wow.
He still has that. And we were doing the interview, and I said, "Do you mind if I read this to you?" He said, "No, go ahead." And dude, I started reading this message back to him. The eyes of the free world are upon you, and it just hit me that I was getting to read this this message, and he'd been given this message by General Montgomery's aide as well, just before they went. So to read this to someone who was there, the original piece, I thought I'm never going to get to do this again, and the fact that I've got to do this once is just incredible and an honor. And he was fine listening to it.
Keep it together.
Trying to cry, trying to keep it together, bro. I was like, oh my god, do not cry, because it's like, I do feel like these books come with a big emotional burden and stuff. I don't sleep very well when I write them again. It's almost like I'd say secondhand nightmares, if you know what I mean. Like it's that kind of stuff. And
writing about true stories takes a toll.
Yeah.
I it just immediately makes me think of working on Violence of Action, which is a much more contemporary book, but a similar theme in that it focuses on the human experience and the soldier experience and all of that. And, some of these guys I knew, many of them I didn't, but it was all from, my regiment. And it was probably of any of the books that or any of the projects, articles, books, otherwise that I've worked on, probably the unhealthiest I was during that period. I mean, not great sleep. I would write through these binges that would just have me shoveling down like junk food and whiskey and not sleeping for more than a couple hours every other night at certain junctures, not the entire time, but certain junctures, and being put into a really foul mood after certain writing certain portions of the book and stuff. And I can just imagine, I mean, this isn't the first book that you've written about soldier experiences before, but it still had to have taken a toll at certain junctures, especially knowing that you as a young British infantryman yourself at one point stood on the shoulders of these guys, 60, 70 years later.
Yeah. I mean, it's, these are my granddad's contemporaries, these people are people who taught my parents in school, they're people who, I think, gave us a fantastic opportunity in Britain and stuff. And I don't want to take this podcast politically, but when you hear people say that you hear these veterans questioning, was it worth it? That, I think, makes you think, have we let these people down in our decision making? And it just brings up a lot of emotions, put it that way. But to kind of get back to the question about, was I able to interview people? For Voices of Victory, I was interviewed a 102-year-old. And I put his story separate at the end of the book to kind of try and touch on these things. Because again, it's always an honor and an amazing experience to get to meet these people. But I do find that, again, like when I'm going home in the car, I'm often very kind of, because, it's usually a few-hour drive, and I'm kind of really quite subdued after. So I'm thinking, like, God, it's not going to be long. These people aren't going to be here. And I've lived all my life, same as you have, and same as anyone else listening, all our lives have been with these people in our society. And I don't really like the idea of us not having them around. I don't feel it's a coincidence that the less of them are around, the more our society seems to flirt with war again. I think it's a lot easier to have had these decades of peace when the people in power, the people who have, and by power I mean at all levels of society, not just at the top, but when we lose the people who truly know the cost. Is that the point where, you're doomed to repeat it? But I want to say something on a positive note. I was one of the people that I chose as a quote unquote main voice for the book. Some people obviously get more page time than others because they might have been involved in more things or they're better at explaining things. I will say this, well, if you're thinking of buying the books, I am a lot better explaining things with my fingers and my words than I am in my mouth, which is why I'm an author and not a professional speaker. But one of the guys, the other thing as well is sometimes as a soldier, there's some blokes who you think, oh yeah, I like this guy, I like his stories. And there's other ones that you go, God, I wish I'd served with this bloke. You know what I mean? You go, I'd love to serve with this bloke, because they just strike you as someone like, yeah, I'd love to follow this bloke into a fight, which isn't a sane, rational thing to think, but as a soldier, that's what you kind of come away thinking. And his son reached out to me and said that he'd read the book and that, he was very happy that someone had written about his dad. And I was like, well, hope you don't mind me asking, but do you have any pictures of him and things I could see? Because I'd never seen this. I'd heard is a voice. So, you build up a picture of this guy. So he shared pictures with me, and I was able to send him his dad's citation for his military medal. And, we have a chat on Instagram and stuff. And that was a powerful kind of moment for me. And I have had a lot of people reach out whose parents were involved in either D-Day, Normandy, or the Battle of Germany. The Battle of Germany one especially, I think, has been a bit different because people have a lot of people didn't know what they might have known their granddad was in Germany in 1945, but they've never had anything to understand it because there's no movies about it.
No,
there's no TV shows about it, and there's very few books about it. So I think that's been very gratifying to be able to give someone a bit of context for what their relative, might have gone through and things. And so yeah, it's always, I think, a real kind of honor when somebody reaches out and it's touched them in a very personal way because their family members had been involved. That makes me, those are the times where you definitely think, right, I'm doing the right job here.
Yeah, I can't recommend people enough to go pick up, particularly this book, D-Day, The Unheard Tapes. This is the one that I have. And what was the other book that you have? I don't think I have a copy of that one.
Oh, I have to sort that out. Voices of Victory.
Voices of Victory.
Yeah, if you've got Spotify Premium, it's available to listen to as an audiobook on there, or it's on Audible. One of the things we do with the audiobook is the beginning of each chapter, that there's a passage at the beginning of each chapter which is the veteran's own words, own voice, and then the rest of it is narrated by a very, very skilled narrator who just did a fantastic job. I think I've thrown 150 people with different accents his way, and hats off to him for doing such a good job.
Yeah, these are important projects. I want, you have these great books in the nonfiction space. You're also an excellent fiction writer. In that respect, there's a few things I envy about you as an author, Geraint. One of them is you are very prolific in your writing. Like, you have many, many titles to your name. You get through books a lot faster than I do as far as writing them goes. And I'm also a little bit envious of you being able to have dabbled in both fiction and nonfiction. I don't have any fiction titles to my name yet, and it's something that I'm really interested in doing. But one of your books, I think this was maybe the first book that you gave me. It's called Siege. It's not your first book. And it's not your only book on sort of the theme of the Roman Empire and Roman Legionnaires, but I'd love to kind of dive in here on some of that. And I want to preface this too. It's a lot easier for me to engage in something like D-Day and World War II because I know a lot more about it than I do Roman history. So you're going to really have to hold my hand here because I am very interested. This is like the learning portion for me. I want to learn more about this experience. And, I think we could just start off here with, like, what era in theater are you most anchored in when it comes to your books about the Romans, and why did that area or that time capture your imagination?
So it's the first book set in the Varian disaster, which occurred in AD 9, or whatever letters they're using to describe these things these days. I can't keep up. And this was when essentially the Roman Empire appeared unstoppable. 3 legions, which was over, three legions would be about 15% of Rome's military might at the time, went into a big forest in Germany and never came out. I find that story fascinating because all we know from the kind of the text is we know a little bit around the politicking about what kind of what led to that, what came after, but we don't know any of the stories about the people who are inside that forest. And it almost makes me think it's almost a bit like...
Where is this in modern day Germany? Would this be in the Bavarian region there, or...?
I might have to Google this one. It's called the Teutoburger Forest, okay. Right? So, and I mean, there is a forest there now. I say ironically, there was actually a battle fought there, which I covered in Voices of Victory as well, where a British battalion went in and suffered the same kind of experience.
Wow.
The forests at this time in Europe, I think it's quite hard for us now to kind of grasp the scale of these forests. But I'm not going to try and give an exact point. I can see it in my head. Yeah. I don't know how to explain it because I don't think it's very far from Munster, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I love the idea of that, because there's so many ways you can take that story, right? You could do a supernatural story. You could have them that it's you could that there's more to it being a case of two armies fighting against each other. But I think I started kind of researching the book while I was in Iraq, and there's a lot of similarities between us in Iraq at the time, which was a technically superior army fighting tribes people, who don't have the same equipment or anything like that, but know the land, get to pick the time and place of the fights. And also a lot of the political hubris of, we can go where we want with our big army when we want, and everything will work out fine because we're Rome or we're Britain and America. And the locals get to have a say in that, and not always the big locals, but yeah. And they can make life extremely tough for you. Now,
I mean, when we think about this time period, 89, 80, the AD versus BC, like I said, there's a couple of different letters now, but we're talking 89, 80 on that side of the split. This isn't Germany in the way we think of Germany today. This is still a sort of a fragmented landscape of tribes, and these Germanic tribes that maybe have a lot of Scandinavian influence. This is pre-Viking age, all of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the type of people these legionnaires may have encountered in there during this time?
Well, it's probably like me trying to fight you. Like,
for people, really, we're both sitting down. For people, for reference, Geraint's a little bit shorter than me. I'm 6'5", 480 pounds at this point, and Geraint keeps himself a trim, probably still able to get out there after it on the battlefield.
Yeah, 5'9" if I stretch my back. But yeah, so it's the leader of this kind of confederation of tribes had been raised. He was a German prince, and like a lot of kind of places throughout history, it was quite often, if you kind of were trying to have dealings with people or keeping people on your good side, you take their nobility in and raise them in your ways, and kind of try and tie them to you culturally and give them a career in the military and that kind of thing. And it looks like this guy Varus, Arminius, he took all this training, got very good at knowing how to fight the Romans at their own game. But whereas a lot of people will try and, if you've got an army that fights in one way and it's been very successful, the other side might try and copy that tactic and go, and we'll try and fight them the way they fight. He just looked at what's the strength of the Roman army. Well, that was fighting their formations in big open spaces. Okay, well, let's get them in the woods where they can't keep their formations. Let's use hit and run tactics. Because what had happened just before these events in Germany is Rome had just fought a very costly war in essentially the Balkans for a few years, where a revolt had dragged on for several years. In the end, 15 Roman legions had to go in to put this thing down, which, again, we're talking nearly half the strength of the empire. And it was, hit and run tactics, hill fort fights, all this, a real bloody protracted war. And I think Arminius had learnt from that as well. And so he befriended the governor, who was in charge of these three legions, the way that their political kind of system works. It was political appointments to military positions at that kind of level. And he coaxed them into the forest. And I've kind of been where they've got the Arminius statue, which I don't think is quite close to where the battlefield are. But I've been into quite a few German forests at this point, and if someone is trying to lure you and your army into there and saying, essentially, he sold Varus on the idea that there was a shortcut through this forest. I could just think, if you just picture those, the forest of Fangorn in Lord of the Rings, and someone being like, yeah, I know a shortcut through here. You might be a bit suspicious.
I mean, these are the same forests that have sparked legends from the Brothers Grimm and all these other places. I mean, there was probably rumors among the legionnaires at that time about it being a haunted forest and all that, probably not being crazy about going in there, because the foot soldier would have known, right? They would have known, what are you talking about? We're going to go in the forest.
Right. And also, like, from where the areas that these men were from, that they're from agricultural land and cities and things, they're not at home in forests, much like, say, Americans in Vietnam.
Yeah.
The environment can be as scary as the enemy. And the other thing as well I'm having to throw my mind back 10 years in here in research, so it's taken a while. So guess this, I probably got the pronunciation wrong. He was another of these German chieftains, and he knew what Arminius was up to and told Varus, and Varus just didn't listen to him. And again, I just feel like there's so many similarities between Afghanistan and Iraq here, where people are like, look, you don't want to go into this place with a big army. That's not going to work. They're going to ambush you and do this and that. And people just go, I know better. I know what I'm doing. I'll take the army. And so that was the first book, called Blood Forest, which was later re-released under the title of Ambush. If you are a writer listening to this, I would advise you, if your publisher says that they want to re-release the book under a different title, try and say no, because if people end up buying the book twice, they won't blame the publisher, they'll blame you, and you'll get a lot of nasty DMs, and you'll probably people will call you greedy, and you'll get nasty DMs, and you'll probably lose a reader. So put your foot down. I knew it was a bad idea at the time. I should put my foot down more.
Younger writer, you don't know what you don't know.
Younger writer, you don't know what you don't know. Well, the thing is, I thought it was a bad idea at the time, but when you first get in your book deals, you're not as willing to fight your corner as much, are you? So, I just wanted to tell the story through the grunt's eye view. We don't have any stories passed down to us from Roman soldiers. I mean, a lot of them would have been illiterate, which again has been the case throughout a lot of history. It's really, this
is why I'm such a big proponent of people in the more modern area. We have the most literate soldiers across the world in any time throughout history. And I think it's so important for people to write down their stories, even if they don't go publish them or anything. Write them down, print it out, put it in your desk drawer, whatever. At minimum, your kids will have it. But we have an opportunity right now to capture what the soldier experience is, what the war experience is, in a way that's really never been possible throughout history. Most military battles have only been written through the eyes of historians and generals and politicians. That's it. And right now, everybody just about that has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, or any of these other places, Horn of Africa, any place else, you've probably got access to a laptop, a word processor, and, write your experiences down. Sorry. My little hill that I constantly...
I totally agree.
That's my soapbox.
No, mate, I'm here for that. I'm here for that soapbox. I totally agree with you. So we don't have the stories from those people, but I think you can use a bit of logic, a bit of your own experiences, and a bit of knowledge of history to fill in a lot of blanks about what would happen. And instead of, like you said, trying to tell the story from a fiction point of view, from the general's eye view, I wanted to just tell the story of one section of guys, because you know what it's like in the military. Outside your platoon, you don't even know what's going on. No, right. So when people are talking about, and this is something I come across when I'm reading books or memoirs from Vietnam, the Second World War, the First World War, Korea, whatever it is, everyone's like, yeah, I don't know what's going on outside of, a few meters to my left and right. And that's how I kind of wanted to tell this story in the forest. So even though you've got these huge world-changing, because it changed the fate of Europe, this battle, all that squad of soldiers cares about is the 8 of them going home. And I think the Romans kind of appeal to me as well, because I find it quite interesting that the Romans chose 8 as the number of a section. The British Army use 8 after a lot of trial and error. And there's certain things throughout history, like the amount of weight that hoplite carried is about the weight of what an infantry soldier carries now. There's, we're still people at the end of the day, no matter which era you're fighting in. And a lot of these, a lot of the rules about how many people can work out well in a subsection and all those kind of things just hold true over the ages. And the other thing as well I wanted to do with the book was, I might have gone a bit too heavy-handed with it, but what was the mental effects of war on Roman soldiers? And I've had academics I've seen them talk about my stuff online and say, well, we've got no evidence that Roman soldiers would have PTSD. So like you said, who was writing the histories we've got? They're all politicians or historians who were writing to gain favor with the emperor at the time. You don't gain you don't gain favor in Rome by saying, and then his army, those that survived the battle in the forest, all had, nightmares and things like that. That wouldn't fit the ideal of a Roman soldier. And we weren't even recognizing shell shock in the First World War. We were still putting people against the post and shooting them for things like that. So the idea that because we don't have a written record of it means that we can't prove it.
And that's where some of your platform as a soldier yourself, as a combat veteran yourself, you can say, okay, I wasn't there for that specific battle, but I have been a soldier. I have experienced war. There's a few things that are going to be that are going to have a through line, and particularly in your case, you have studied soldiers throughout time in World War II and stuff, and you've seen that there are certain through lines, that there are soldiers, and certain things are going to be true regardless of what time frame they happened in. And I think some of those leaps that you make with legionnaires and soldiers in the Roman army, I don't think that they're as big of a leap as maybe some historians would have you believe.
Yeah, and I think you could take an evidence-based approach as well. And so to the argument that Romans wouldn't have suffered with PTSD because they lived in a very violent society, okay, let's go and have a look at the studies of what it's like, what the levels of PTSD are like of children who have grown up in Mexico in the last 20 years. Oh, the levels of PTSD are through the roof. Who would have thought? Living in a violent society makes you have anxiety and anger response.
Domestic violence rates are probably higher. Alcoholism is probably higher. There's lots of trends you could probably dissect.
Yeah, I think part of the problem with this is people conflate PTSD with like moral injury. So it's like, maybe they wouldn't have had issues of they might have not had the same kind of issues as, let's say, someone who came from small town America who finds himself, killing in Vietnam. It might have been a different kind of approach a different kind of result from that. But the being the being in a brutal environment itself, will change your brain chemistry. And I think the other thing as well is, people say, well, they used to go and watch gladiators for sport and things. Like, what do you think kids are watching on their phones now? I could go on Instagram now and in the next 10 minutes probably see 100 people die.
Most of the legionnaires were not going to the Colosseum and watching gladiators. That was not something that was made available to most of the people that were foot soldiers in the Roman army. And I think it's interesting what you bring up about moral injury too, because moral injury is not something that you see it's a very individual thing. Because morals are an individual thing, right? So what bothers you in the same action would not necessarily bother me and vice versa. I've come into this before. I've had conversations with veterans where we've, after maybe one too many drinks and it's a late night and all those things, you start talking about stuff and there's things that bother me that they're like, oh, really? That you even think about that? Like, that's kind of a whatever thing. And like, oh geez, am I just like kind of there's words I could use, but and then they'll talk about something that bothers them. I'm like, oh really? That bothers you? And so it's so individual today. It would have been the same back then. You can't, paint with broad strokes across the entire Roman society and say guys didn't experience moral injury differently. Well, somebody that grew up in Rome would probably have different things that bothered them than somebody that grew up a farmer in the what is now present day the Italian countryside, and never mind the people that were conscripted along the way into the Roman army from just entirely different cultures altogether. There's going to be different things that bother them, and they'll all experience moral injury to some degree, but they're going to experience it for different reasons. And just because you were exposed to violence in one way or another doesn't mean that you're not going to experience moral injury. So I don't know. I think it's a thing that needs to be talked about more, in my opinion.
I just think that I'd like these academics to. Maybe I think one of the things that we should always try and do, especially as authors, is you've got to put yourself in other people's shoes. That's the prerequisite for the job.
You have to have a capacity for empathy.
Right. And so it's a question to them on this kind of thing would be, okay, you've known your friend for 5 years. He's now lying with his stomach ripped open, his guts are hanging out, and he's screaming. When he dies, you just go, oh well, and move on. Of course not. Like, the idea that you could just, like, move on. And I think one of the things that always kind of grips me a bit about historians, I'm generalizing myself here, but certain academics, is that I think there's a habit in humans of, we say, well, that was history, but we're different. And it's like, we're really not, bro. Human, like, as you say, soldiers are soldiers are soldiers, humans are humans are humans. You know, take away this, I was going to say air conditioner, I don't need that in the bloody UK. Take away this heating system right now, and the food in the fridge, and everything like that. And we all tend to want the same things, behave the same ways, and that's a great cheat code for authors, because it means you can pick other periods. And if it was the case that people were different, then it wouldn't really be interesting to read about, because a lot of the things about, a lot of the reasons that a book will touch you is, you know, the idea of let's just say, you know, a few hundred years ago, the idea that just a small or not even a few hundred years ago, but the fact that a small infection could take away the life of your child or someone that you loved. Now, thankfully, that's not the case for us in America and the UK now. But we could still imagine how awful that would be, that someone just got a small cut on their arm and now it looks like they're going to die. We can place ourselves in that position and feel how terrible that is and feel how scared it is. And that's why historical books work, because, you know, people are people.
Well, and we have examples of people having these emotions. Anyway, you think this same period, 89 AD, that means it's, it's in the same century, roughly, as the events that led to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Well, crucifixions back then were a common form of putting somebody to death. It was one of the more extreme forms, but it would be, and this was during the Roman Empire that this happened, right? Well, you could say that the people that witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, that maybe that was not the first crucifixion that they had witnessed, yet we still have written record of people being very distraught over it. That it was a horrible thing to witness. And this is all during the same time period, right? So, and those people would have also been exposed to, like I said, crucifixions and other horrible forms they would have been exposed to violence at a rate much more, and they were distraught over that. So that alone, I think, is evidence to say that, like, yeah, humans were still humans, and they feel the feels. And
if it wasn't horrible, why would you do it? The whole point of doing it is it's a deterrence. If people are like,
send a message.
Well, I don't care if that happens to my family. I don't care. I'm tough. I've been raised in a brutal thing. You know, it wouldn't work. The last thing I'll say on this as well is that there are records of people leaving very kind of touching tributes to pet dogs and cats. You know. So, you know, it just goes.
That's enough right there. Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's like, well, okay, well, maybe they got soppy about their dog, but not about their squad friends getting butchered.
Yeah, crazy. Well, so speaking of the records and stuff, you know, unlike recorded interviews with D-Day veterans and World War II veterans, you know, the type of research that you would do for a fiction book like this is a little bit different. What were the sources that you used? And was it not just sort of philosophers? Was it also archaeologists and things like that? Or what was the research process like?
When it comes to research, honestly, like this, I think this holds true for any book. To write a book, you've got to read a library, right? And every book that you write will almost it's a collaborative effort with all these other authors that you've never met and might have even been dead for hundreds of years, because their work is going to inform you so much, whether it's picking up on their style of writing that may influence you, or key facts and figures that you build your book around. So I think there's when it comes to these fiction ones, there's two kind of veins that really informed it. One is reading war memoirs, because if you want to understand soldiers and how they behave in a certain situation, you need to hear from soldiers. So there's almost a bit of like Vietnam memoir, especially in this book, because the fact that they're in the forest and everything, and what that claustrophobia brings, the hit and run tactics. I feel like there's a lot of Vietnam memoirs that probably informed this book. In terms of writing style as well, I deliberately tried to put a bit of Michael Herr kind of dispatches writing style in there. There's even like a very direct nod to him in one of the later books, Legion.
Which, for those listening, another excellent read. Michael Herr was a reporter that embedded with forces in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. His book Dispatch is a collection of his work from that time. Absolutely excellent read.
Yeah, brilliant work, and one of those books where it's. Read it as a kid, probably read it every few years since, it's fantastic. So there's those kind of books that inform in style and character behavior. And then there's, we need to know what are the key events that were going on, who are the key players, because even though the story's about the squad, you still want the reader to be able to have an idea of the big picture and that kind of thing. So for that, you could go to the classics. Tacitus, I think it was, the Annals. I think he has the passage on it. Like, again, this was 10 years ago. No, actually, it's longer than that. I wrote the outline for this 20 years ago. So, wow. It was while I was in Iraq. I was working on. Did the research while I was in Iraq on my first deployment. I took a big box of books out, and then books about. Essentially, if I went on Amazon and I found a book about this forest, about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, I bought it and I read it and I read it and I read it and I made notes. And over years, I built a story about it. The first draft, the idea for the first book was very different to what came out at the end, because when I did the first draft, I hadn't really experienced any combat or soldiering myself. And then by the time I came to writing the final book, I'd done a few deployments, done Afghanistan, did that, and had a better idea of what it meant to be a soldier at war. I think the other thing as well that informed the book was when I wrote this, I was in the extremely angry phase of dealing with my own post-traumatic stress. And when I read the book now, so I'm writing book 6 in the series. The first 2 books were published by Penguin. I then switched to another publisher to do the prequel trilogy. And the idea would always be that I'd come back and finish off where the second book left off. And I don't like it when authors leave series unfinished. I don't like that. We're all there with Game of Thrones. None of us like it. And I feel like if someone has invested the hours and hopefully the emotional investment in following along in your creation, you have a duty to not leave that person hanging. Now, unfortunately, having bills to pay and that kind of thing, a book isn't something you can knock out in a night. And it's also something that I wouldn't want to do short shrift for and do an hour here, an hour there, because then you can just tell in the writing, when something's been dipped in and out of. So I finally kind of at the place where I've got the space kind of to get it done. And I think it's been really interesting for me sitting down to write it, because obviously I wanted to refresh myself on what had been going on in the other book. So I sat down to read the others, and then I tried to write in the same vein, and I've just found that I couldn't. My voice for the character, he was so angry at the world and at politicians, especially in the first book, and at the senselessness of war. And I'll have a lot of those things still, but I could not, I think I didn't probably realize at the time how much of that main character was me, and probably me, if the real me, and then what I wish I could be. Everyone wants to be a fucking good soldier, great soldier.
Jack Carr does a great job of explaining that his character James Reese is, yes, partially based on him, but he's also everything that he wasn't, and is much more incredible than, I think he does a great job of explaining that. And certainly with this, you can't help but inject your own. That's how you make an authentic character. It has to have elements of you in there. And I think it's interesting that you talk about that you don't have the same anger that you did when you originally wrote this character. Now, all these years later, is where you've learned how to process things, and you've processed certain things more at this point, I imagine. And you see the same thing with musicians a lot of times, where that those early records that were released, they're angry, they got that youthful anger over different things, and then as that artist goes on, there's more of a soft edge to it, and people say, oh, they changed or whatever, they lost their edge. But it's no, you grew and you matured, and you look at the world a little bit differently now. You're not necessarily a different person, but maybe the lens has shifted a little bit. How much of that has been true for you?
I think you hit the nail on the head there. The lens has shifted. So when I look at the early book and how I felt at the time, there's the world, the all-encompassing world, and I want it to be a certain way, and I think it can be a certain way, and it's sort of frustrating that it's not, and there's a few people that fuck things up for everybody else, and you want to change that, and the fact that you can't is incredibly frustrating. And then I think maybe over time, it's not that stuff bothers me. I like the senselessness of war and the emotion that I feel for what other people are going through has probably grown. Like, I feel like my empathy is on the way up. I think it's more, and this is kind of what my characters realize, is you can't change the world. Mm-hmm. If you're very lucky, you may be able to change the lives of a few people. Yeah. And that's kind of where my head is at now. You know, Voices of Victory. It sold well for a book that wasn't about D-Day or anything. And when I always use like football stadiums to picture sizes of the crowds. And so I picture certain size football stadium now and go, oh, okay, now there's that many people who know the stories of people like Fred Cooper, who fought in North Africa and Italy and Normandy and Germany. That's amazing. I don't need the whole world to know. I'd love the whole world to know, but there's that many people now, and hopefully they'll tell someone. But even if it's just that many people, that was worthwhile. And then in my own life, you know, I think, you know, my life could be quite chaotic. I think, you know, sometimes I think I've got to bring a bit of order to my own life before I start stressing out on what's going on in a wider picture. It doesn't mean that I don't, and it doesn't mean that my character in these books doesn't. But I think through going through a lot of experiences, like, you know, when you're in the army and you go to combat with people, you know, your world is very small. That's like we were saying earlier. It's like, it's terrible if you hear about someone else dying in another battle group or something. That's awful. You don't want that to happen. But let's be honest, the people that you matter most about are the people who are literally within arm's length of you. And that's kind of the place that my character has got to. It's like, okay, I can't save the world from war and from Rome, but maybe I can save these few people that matter the most to me. I don't really want to say too much more because it might give away a bit about the book. But I just found it fascinating, dude. When I sat down, I was like, oh, I just can't. Because one of the things I think I can do quite well is like I do a lot of ghostwriting for people, and I think I've got a skill for, if I spend a few hours with you and I listen to you talk, or I can pick up someone's voice, and people think, well, isn't that what every ghostwriter does? That's what they're supposed to do. But we've all read a book where we've gone, that is not the person that I listen to on a podcast or whatever. You know, we've all been there, like where we've read books and they just speak in a way that person does not speak in. Even if you're, you know, putting your, you know, even if we're just allowing for the fact that sometimes we have a presentation version of ourselves that we might put into artistic works, you know, we could just tell sometimes that poor old ghostwriter might have not even had half an hour on the phone with whoever was the celebrity that they were writing the book for. And so I found it quite interesting that I'm quite good at writing other people's voices, but I can't emulate that voice of my own from 10 years ago.
It's a unique challenge. Well, I'm curious about, like you said, you were writing this you started the outline for it on your first deployment in Iraq. You know, when you look at both the tactics and maybe even the logistics of the Roman army at that time, is there anything that stood out to you as like, man, that's very similar. Or they were doing something that we still do today, or anything like that?
Well, I'll say this: I wouldn't want to be an infantry soldier in the Roman army. They basically, I think it was, again, I'm pulling these details out from a while back, but I believe it was like they covered 20 mile a day, I think was what they need to cover. And when you stopped, you dug in a camp. So you dug in you dug a ditch around the camp, you built a rampart, so you've got all of that, and then you're doing your sentries through the nights and stuff, and you're carrying a lot of your kit on your back. So I think if there's similarities, it's infantry, you've got to carry shit on your back, and you've got to, and not only that, but you've got to be able to fight a battle at the end of it. Mm-hmm. And your black taxis, as we call our boots in the British Army, are going to get you to the battle, but then you've got to be in a fit state to fight at the end of it. I think that is kind of the probably the main one I take away is infant. That's why I feel like I never wanted to serve in anything other than the infantry, because I feel like that's the branch of service that it just has so much continuity throughout history. Being uncomfortable, carrying heavy shit, and then being expected to fight at the end of it. Like it's when I was in Afghanistan, when you're moving around the ground out there, and there's only certain places where, certain of these big wadis and stuff are passable and things. And I'd think about that kind of thing. I'd think, God, what other armies have, because, the British have been in Afghanistan a few times.
The Roman Empire extended out into Afghanistan, didn't it?
Well, I'm not sure about the Romans one, but Alexander the Great,
that's probably what I'm thinking of.
He was there. Yeah, and I was thinking, like, damn, there's a good chance that Alexander, or part of his army, came through this same crossing point. Because, like I said, doing the Voices of Victory book, Xanten is where the British crossed the Rhine. The Romans had a fort at Xanten because it was it was a key point for them there. The Teutoburg Forest. The Germans decided to choose that for a battleground for the same reason: high ground, cover. It's these battles are 2,000 years apart, but key terrain is key terrain, and infantry warfare is infantry warfare. Whether you're closing with a rifle in your hand or a sword in your hand, you still got to close with and engage the enemy. And maybe things will change. But for thousands of years, that's been the way of it.
Yeah. What about rules of engagement and sort of unit discipline? Right? Did you find that the Roman view of rules of engagement was very different than modern views?
To be honest, I wouldn't want to give a definitive answer on that, because that is not something that jumps immediately back to mind. What I would say is I think it was probably quite similar to, say, how the British Empire, because we're talking about colonizing nations here, right? And sometimes when you're colonizing, there's a time where you use utter brutality and violence in order to subjugate. But then if you behave like that all the time on a population that you're now occupying, as we know ourselves from Iraq and stuff, it doesn't work. You have to do the hearts and minds thing. So I don't know, in the Roman army, it would make use of people, drawn into the auxiliary. What they offered was, if you join the auxiliary services, so you're not a Roman legionnaire, but you're, the kind of like, you might be like a light infantry unit or a cavalry unit maybe, and you serve your 20 years, you get your citizenship at the end of it and stuff. So, they wanted to encourage people to adopt the Roman ways and things. And so I imagine a lot of times when they were probably, if they were recently conquered places, it was probably probably quite draconian if you stepped out of line. But I think the idea is they want people to integrate. In terms of the actual discipline inside the Roman Legion itself, I mean, it was iron. Penalties to most things, death. Fall asleep on sentry duty, death. Abandon your post, death. Run away from a battle, death. It was I think it would have made like the administration a lot more simple when you've just got one outcome for everything, you know. But yeah, it was pretty brutal.
Yeah. Well, out of as we kind of wrap things up here, I know you've got a concert to get to. I'm very jealous.
Hans Zimmer,
man,
baby.
I am jealous.
Yeah.
Like I said, Interstellar is one of my favorite movies. I mean, he's done so many iconic scores, but that movie and that score just stands out to me so much. But, across World War II, the Roman times, fiction, nonfiction, you've written through so much and on a lot of tough subjects. What was the hardest sort of section or passage you've ever had to write, and why?
Oh man. Well, there's a few that jump to mind. Writing Brothers in Arms, which was about my time in Afghanistan, writing about an IED strike on my vehicle, which led to the death of one of the guys. That was incredibly hard to write.
I got that here too. Brothers in Arms.
Here we go. That's it. It's Afghanistan book when it's got a Chinook on the cover.
Yeah.
Obligatory. That was really hard to write. And not just the writing that, but then I'm very anti-war, as I said, as I think most veterans are, right? And so I didn't want to gloss over any details about how horrible things are in an IED strike. But then you also want to be mindful and respectful of the feelings of the families. So I think it wasn't necessarily writing the passage, but reaching out to the families and saying, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'd like to do, and this is why. But obviously, your wishes come first. And their thing was, we want people to know too. So there was that. There's certain parts of doing the World War II books that have just had me in tears. Voices of Victory. There was. I got to the end of the book, and obviously it's the last. It's the campaign it's the campaign that ended the war, right? It's the final campaign, and we finish with victory in Europe, and there's a part of us as human beings who can get jingoistic very quickly, because it's like, yeah, we won, we beat, Germany was at our doorstep, and we came all the way back across Europe, and we won the war. Rule Britannia, get your flag out. And there's a part of that that's worthy, right? Honestly, that is an incredible accomplishment. But I thought it didn't feel right for me to finish that book on that kind of that note, because that victory is mile after mile after mile after mile of bloodshed and destruction. And so there were some stories that I didn't know where to fit into the book because there wasn't a time or place given to them or anything, but except that they happened in Germany. And one of those stories was like, I can't even repeat it on it because I know I'll start crying. But there was one of those stories in there, dude. And I think about it, it just pops into my head quite often when I think about that. And when I, it's one of those ones where, this was like a guy in his 80s telling this story, but when he told it, you could just hear that he would probably have been 23 or something at the time. I don't know if there'd ever been a story that I'd heard from in all these interviews where you just heard him back in that moment. And I think as well, like for me on a personal note, I think one of the reasons I like a lot of veterans have kind of had struggles is always being raised with this idea of the Second World generation just shrugged it off and got on with life. Now, having listened to hundreds of interviews by these people right now, I know that's all the bullshit. They didn't shrug it off, bother them for the rest of their lives. Like the amount of times that these interviews finish with people saying stuff like, oh yeah, I think about it every day. Oh yeah, I still wake up sometimes thinking about such and such. And there's almost a relief in that because you think, okay, well, we're not different for thinking, for going through these same things, but also it's that acceptance of, well, these guys have lived good lives with that as part of it. So it's, possible. And they've seen a lot more as well. That story in particular, dude, I just, it was just it was clearly so real to him 60 years after it happened. It was still so raw to him. And that, I think, it upset me for another reason as well, which was, God, I wish these people had had more help.
Yeah.
In dealing with this stuff. You know, I wish he'd had, that might have been the first time that he told that story in his life. And I guess I'm going on a tangent here, but it just makes me realize how important it is for us to talk about things.
These are important stories that you've told. Again, both fiction and nonfiction. These are important experiences that you've relayed to the world. And I can't encourage people enough to go pick up these books. Of course, I'm going to throw all the links to all your books in the episode description down there. But Geraint, thank you for taking the time to come on the show. It's always great catching up with you. I owe you a visit over there. You've come over here to visit so much. I owe you one. And, go enjoy the concert tonight. Until the next time.